Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to European Policy Center's online policy dialogue on women and global climate action. My name is Ionela Ciolan, and I'm a research fellow within the Europe in the World program, the TPC. And today I'm your host, and I have the pleasure to moderate this discussion. So we have together with us three excellent speakers that will provide us with very interesting and important topics of discussion. I would start by presenting them, and I'm also grateful to our speakers for making the time to contribute to our discussion today. Thank you very much. So we have together with us today Ms. Bianca Pitt. She is the co-founder of the She Changes Climate organization. Dr. Wanida Lewis. She's a food scientist, a gender and agriculture policy expert at Crescendo Foods in Ghana. And Paula Ellinger da Fonseca. She's a climate action manager at Fundación Avina, and she joined us from Argentina, if I'm not mistaken. Now, some logistical information for our discussion. After we'll have the opening comments from our distinguished speakers, we'll start the Q&A session. So please write your questions in the Q&A box, or if you want to address it yourself, click on the raise hand button. Please be concise as much as possible when writing your questions. And I would like to start by giving the main topics of our discussions today. We know that climate change acts as a threat multiplier that intensifies the socio-political and cultural divergences. And not only that, the environmental degradation, it's also not gender neutral and has a disproportionate impact on women's lives worldwide. So during this discussion, we'll try to speak more about the nexus between women, gender equality, and climate change. So we'll try to address the negative impacts of climate change on women's and girls' lives in the Global South, how to include more women in the climate change forums, especially the upcoming COP27, and the potential consequences of the Russo-Ukrainian War on global climate action and food security. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I will start my question with Dr. Lewis. Let me start by asking you to give us a brief context of the overview between and the connection between women, climate change, and food security, like a general perspective.
Sure. And thank you for having me. So just to give a brief overview, we all know that agriculture is very important around the world. However, agriculture is highly prone to climate change. And that with this sector is predicted to come under increasing stress from climate change-induced increases in temperature, variability in rainfall, and extreme weather events. And if you haven't been paying attention to the weather patterns of wherever you're located in the world, you know, just hearing those two things should give you a clue what's happening. And what ends up, the result of that is that these factors could trigger drought, crop failures, pest and disease outbreaks, and the degradation of land and water resources. Also, you know, when we think about agriculture, it is one of the major source of carbon and non-carbon greenhouse gas emissions, especially as we're hearing more and more about cattle. If you have cattle and you know the grass that they eat, they end up emitting greenhouse gas emissions, and it really is an issue when it comes to the carbon that's being released. You know, of course, with that, you know, of all things with agriculture, it's, you know, we're also seeing this increase as a result of this greenhouse gas emissions increase as a result for increased demand for agricultural products, especially what else is going on in the world. And so these interlinkages, they pose complex, overlapping, and interrelated challenges. And that, of course, it's imperative for promoting food security, as well as rural livelihoods and the adaptation and mitigation are not mutually exclusive. So therefore, we need to think about integrated approaches, especially something, one of the approaches that everyone talks about is climate smart agriculture, and that is vital. And the reason why these approaches are vital is because it increases productivity, enhances adaptive capacity, and reduce net emissions. And of course, not only with climate smart agriculture, but all these approaches, they create this balanced approach in seeking to improve livelihoods, but also increases that productivity and resilience of communities, including women, especially rural women, who also provide mitigation benefits. And so when you think about agriculture, it's really, we think about women's economic empowerment, those things actually are aligned. They are one and the same. Because outside of the West really is that when we think about who is the power player when it comes to agriculture, it's actually women. And so if these climatic stresses are going to make women particularly vulnerable to food insecurity, therefore there's a domino effect around the world. So empowering women is not just necessary for their well-being, but it also means to having a broader ag and development and food security. And so some of the issues that women are facing in ag is not only food distribution and food production, but we're also talking about women's economic empowerment when it comes to access to finance, and then of course, access to land and the policies that surround that. And so when we think about climate change, it doesn't just affect just one person or one gender, it affects everyone. So if women face these numerous obstacles, therefore that means all communities are going to do that. So there is a need to reform these laws when it comes to the burden that women face in responding and adapted to these climatic stresses. But it also means that, how can we talk about getting rid of laws that restrict women's ownership and or access to productive and reproductive resources? So I'll close there.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting start of our discussion. So I would like to move to Ms. Pitt, and I would like you to comment more and give us like an overview on the nexus between women, gender equality, and climate change to complement what already Dr. Luis mentioned.
Thank you very much, Ionela, for convening us all here and for inviting me to come and speak. I'm one of the co-founders of She Changes Climate, which is a campaign and essentially a movement to bring women into leadership for international climate negotiations. I'm normally, when I'm not doing this, an environmental funder, and I sit on the boards of various charities working in this space. And what we found, and I also host a network of women environmental philanthropists, CEOs and founders of charities and foundations in the environmental sector and influencers, broadly speaking. And we're about 80 women around the world. It's called the Women of the Environment Network. And to our great surprise, in October 2020, when we looked with great excitement at the UK that were hosting the COP26, and we were interested in who they had chosen for their team, because no one from us, and we really have some of the leading lights in climate in the UK and the Commonwealth on our team. Nobody had been approached by the UK government to come on board for the leadership of this COP. To our absolute amazement, we found that not a single woman had been chosen for that leadership team. Now, I have to say, up to that point, I kind of hadn't thought about gender equality at all. And, bad me, because I've been working in the environmental space for so long, and I had certainly heard about climate justice and social inequality. And it's more a reflection of the luck I had in my life growing up in the West, educated. I seem to have access to everything I wanted. And I always thought that we had to solve the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, pollution and waste crisis first, because why it's sort of the house is burning, and once we've done that, we can then sort out all the social problems as well. That was my approach, so one thing after another. And it was only that with the beginning of that, essentially, and in a way I'm grateful that this was my awakening, looking at why on earth not a single woman had been chosen for that leadership team, I realized that we indeed live in a world in which women are almost absent from leadership, not just at international climate negotiations, but also in government and business everywhere. And just to give us some figures for those that aren't very well versed on the topic. So for example, we know Not a single woman has been the president of the United States, for example. Only 3.5% of UK prime ministers have been women. Today, only, I think, 26 women are in 26 countries, are either head of state or head of government worldwide. That is astonishing as a number. Only a quarter of the world's parliamentarians are women, only a fifth of the world's ministers are women. So think about that, that 3/4 are men and 4/5 are men. In business, the number doesn't look any better. Only 16% of board members worldwide are women. The FTSE 100, which are the the top UK listed companies, only 7% are women there, for example. And at international climate negotiations, which and I know we'll go into more detail later, where you expect full representation, and we have at least full international representation there. So all the countries of the world come together to discuss climate policy and policy implementation, and that, I would say, is a huge success. However, looking at who's leading those teams and how many women are on those teams, the numbers are still well under 40%. And that is not enough. Why? Because when we look at studies, we see that unless women make actually 70% of the people in the room, they do not speak up. So we will have to think carefully, first of all, about where that problem originates from. And that is the international climate negotiations, as we know, are just a reflection of what happens at the national level. So, if we don't have women in government, in leadership, nationally, we won't find them in international climate negotiations, despite the policies. And we need to think about, how to generally approach that bias that we've got against these women that are actually the champions for solutions. They are the accelerators for climate action. So if we don't get women into leadership, we're not going to be able to achieve the Agenda 2030, and this is something that we all need to urgently address now.
Thank you very much. That's very important, and also links to my further question to Ms. Ellinger. I want to give you the floor to give us an overview of the global climate action. I know that you are an expert on this subject, and I would like to inform our audience that maybe doesn't read so much about these topics in their daily life.
Thank you very much, Ionela, for giving me the floor, for convening us, and especially for bringing together a panel composed by women to discuss such an important topic as global climate action and women in this space. So I'll give a brief overview. I think nowadays it's almost a common sense already, I hope at least, that climate action is urgent and needs to take place now, and that we need the whole of society approach. By that we mean it's not a matter to be taken by business, investors, civil society, or the government, but it's a matter to be taken seriously by all of us. And when we talk about global climate action, there are different categories, if we could say, of types of action that we refer. One of them, of course, is mitigation. And that's very important to ensure that we do not surpass a global warming of 1.5 degrees. We know that if we surpass that, then the consequences for vulnerabilities will just increase, for conflict and many others. So in that sense, it's urgent that we have emissions reductions by 45% by 2030. That's 8 years from now. It's a very transformative action that we need to lead. And net zero by 2050. That means that everything that we emit is somehow captured, so that the total balance is zero of our global greenhouse gas emissions. Another type of action that we need to bring forward regards resilience. The impacts of climate change are felt very differently across the world. By women and youth are the most affected, especially in the global south. So the inequalities that we already see in our societies will just increase, and the impacts of climate change will be both severe on those that are already marginalized. So it's very urgent that we take climate action to increase resilience of marginalized communities and adapt to the impacts of climate change. A third category, of course, is finance, because especially when I'm based in Argentina, I'm Brazilian, based in Argentina, and I work mostly with the Global South. And what we see is that many times there might be commitment, there might be interest in taking action, but the resources, the means to implement actions sometimes lack, or most of the times lack. By that we mean resources, capacities, and technologies. Nowadays, we have a global commitment to raise $100 billion from developed countries to developing world to finance climate action. But even this target, although very, I would say not enough for the challenge we have, is not being met. So these are three areas that I would like to highlight of climate action. Now, how are we doing about that? There is some important progress and in terms of commitments being made, but the commitments are not yet enough. So this year, when we get together for COP27 in Egypt, hopefully countries and other actors of society will have increased their ambition and commitments to climate action. But I would like to bring up another point. Although we have watched a lot of progress in climate commitments, and I praise that, there's still much more that's needed. The most important challenge, I think, is bringing commitments to action. And in that sense, before closing my remarks, I would like to highlight two things that I think are very important when we look for commitments that are being brought to life and transformed into climate action. Because, you know, there was a couple of weeks ago, the IPCC launched a report, and it made clear, you know, it's maybe you take action on climate adaptation action, but if the right approach is not taken, we may do things wrong. We can lead to maladaptation or have negative impacts instead of positive ones. So there are two characteristics that relate very much to the gender issue and to the gender approach that we need to climate action that I would like to highlight. The first is that any climate action should have an holistic approach. So we should not look for mitigation or adaptation, but rather actions that can both reduce greenhouse gas emissions while adapting to climate change, and that tackle the root causes of socioeconomic vulnerabilities. And by that, we necessarily talk about the gender gap. So any climate action should tackle the gender gap and other causes of vulnerability in our society. And the second aspect is that the climate action should be multi-actor and inclusive. Most of the times, youth, women, and indigenous people are seen as the most vulnerable, and even myself talked in this way in my first words. But it's important to note that the marginalized communities and voices are most importantly potential agents for change, and those that can lead us into a new development paradigm. So it's very important to include women, youth, and indigenous people as actors of change that can lead the transition that we need. So I think there's so much to talk about it. So I just wanted to highlight some.
Thank you very much. Yes, you brought some interesting points in the discussion, which I would probably like to follow up during my next questions. But let me remind our participants that if they want to ask questions, they should start writing them now in the chat and not wait to the end of the event when we'll not have the opportunity to take all the questions. And now I will move forward with my second round of questions, and I will start with Dr. Luis. I would like you to develop more on the current negative effects of climate change on women and girls' lives in Africa.
Sure. So, I mean, when it comes to women and girls in Africa, it's a whole, that's a whole talk by itself, right? So one of the biggest things is that the negative effects of climate change is, you're starting to see a change in when rainfall is supposed to happen, right? And so, for instance, in Ghana, we have a major and a minor rainy season, and now and they've started at particular times of the year. And so what ends up happening is that those things are switched. And so now that if you are a farmer, you happen to be a woman, and that people, if your family's relying on your income, now you have to think a little bit more as far as what does that look like for you? What does that mean? I have to travel to another part of the country, or another part of the region, and that poses a safety issue for women and girls. And that's anywhere in the world. If you're traveling by yourself, that can be a safety issue. But of course, when it comes to economic wise, is that if you're depending on, if you don't have proper irrigation, what ends up happening is that it causes a problem when if you're relying on a set amount of money to be made during a set period of time. And so if you are, in a group of women, and a lot of these women go to the markets, they work with farmers, and if they're not a farmer themselves, they work with, farmers to go to the markets to make their money so that they can continue to be, have that livelihood. And if climate change is, affecting that, they won't be able to make the money that they can. And so also too, we're talking about, with climate change, we're talking about rainfall, but also temperatures. If we're starting to see increased temperatures, that's going to cause a lot of factors to be triggered when it comes to soil, when it comes to things being available, and the list goes on and on. But in particular in Africa, of course, is that you have a lot of women who do travel, and that's one of the biggest risks, is that they just travel to try to make the salary that they can, even if they're I think a lot of the times people assume that market women do not make a lot of money, and they actually do make a lot of money depending on what you sell. But what happens with this climate change is that if you don't have any, if it's drought or it's flooding, that causes you to pivot. And then if you have to travel, that means that you're going to have a safety issue. If your husband passes away all of a sudden and you can't have access to the land, then you won't be able to, make the money that you can, because now you'll be in court. And that can take several years for that to be resolved. So that's just a few of the things that climate change can do, and how it affects women and girls. And especially if the parent has pulled out their child out of education system so that they can help with their family.
Thank you very much. This is also very insightful for us to understand how women in the global south are affected by the climate change. And I would like to stick to this question and ask Ms. Ellinger about how the negative effects of climate change are affected and are perceived by women and girls in Latin America.
Thank you, Ionela. Well, there are many similarities to the scenario that Dr. Lewis expressed. When it comes to the impacts of climate change, women have less capacity to respond than men in general. And that's why they are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, because capacities to respond are lower. They usually have less access to credit, to technology, to internet. They are away from jobs. And the COVID crisis just increased this disparity. There's a recent study that showed that we moved back with the COVID crisis 10 years in terms of participation of women in the workforce. So instead of progressing, we are going backwards. That means also increasing the vulnerability of women to climate change in Latin America. And if they have less capacities to respond to the impacts of climate change, of course, this has impacts in terms of livelihoods, health, loss of property and income, destruction of their homes, and so on. And I could share different cases, but there is one that's, for me, it's very symbolic by the name. In Brazil, in the semi-arid region, the women who are left behind by their husbands in conditions of drought are called the widows of drought. That is because when there is a lack of water and long droughts in the semi-arid regions, then men have to go to cities and other regions to look for jobs, and they leave behind their women taking care of the house and kids, facing very challenging circumstances. And what we have seen is that this was a phenomenon that has been documented due to drought in the region, but this is increasing and is supposed to increase in the coming years due to the impacts of climate change. So I think it's very symbolic, the name of, we might see more widows of drought.
Thank you very much. So now I'd like to move to Ms. Pitt. We already heard about how climate change is affecting directly and quite negatively the life of women and girls around the world, and especially in the global south. And you also started to briefly mention how women are basically excluded from the climate change forums. And I would like you to expand more on the inclusion of women in climate change forum, and also how can we make sure that women are more included in these frameworks of cooperation and negotiation, and especially how can include more women voices, and also as Ms. Ellinger mentioned, also youth voices and other people's voices in the COP27.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. It's a very important question. We call always for the inclusion of women in all their diversity. I mean, you generally, because it's a convention from states all around the world, you have at least that international representation. Yeah, the diversity, age diversity is not there. Indigenous people are not at the leadership tables yet. They have come as guests at least, and have been able to speak at these conferences now. Also the latest one, certainly in Glasgow, saw Indigenous people, however, often in demonstrations on the outside of the blue and green zone, and that is not enough. We need to now, because they, for example, for those that aren't familiar with the work of Indigenous people, they protect the countries, the last bit of land that is looked after by Indigenous people is the most biodiverse, rich land on this planet. What does it tell us? It means that Indigenous people are extremely good at looking after biodiversity, and we should be really learning from them. So if we're trying to find solutions to our climate crisis, and flora and fauna is extremely important in that, nature-based solutions, then we need to start also listening to Indigenous people. And this is why we want to see them included at these conferences. And when we started this, we became aware, as we've discussed just now, about the negative impacts on women and girls around the world of the climate crisis. And what we wanted to look at was, what do women actually bring to the table? What happens, what changes when women are included in decision making? What are the positive effects? Now, and I'm often asked, well, what do women bring to the table? And I respond to this question now by saying generally that, men are not asked what they bring to the table if they're brought into leadership. So quite frankly, I don't think women should have to justify what they bring to the table. But we did some research anyway, and it was very interesting to see that indeed there was a link to, I would say, effectiveness in environmental policy and implementation and women. So it showed that that countries that had more female parliamentarians, for example, had better climate policy and low emissions, that women were more likely to ratify international environmental treaties. They were more likely to create protected land areas. They were also more likely to disclose and work on carbon disclosure schemes, for example, when they were part of companies and boards of companies in this case. What we found is so the absence will have a real effect on how effective these climate negotiations are. And when you look at the successful climate negotiations, in particular Paris, it was led by a very strong female team, Christiana Figueres, Laurence Tubiana. And when I look worldwide, there's some incredible women, both on the streets all these wonderful youth activists, and I would say Greta Thunberg has done a huge amount, and I'm hugely grateful to her for really moving the dial, all the way to the many very accomplished women who have been working for decades on climate action and in sustainability. But when you look at the policymakers, the ones that make the decision, we just don't have the women there, and that's where we need them now, at the top of these tables. As one of my roles, I work with a not-for-profit law firm called Client Earth. Client Earth is an unusual creature, I would say, because they're both law firm and charity at the same time, and they take action against governments. Partly they also inform governments on policy. They have an office in Brussels and work with the European Union. And observing their work over the last decade also, I have to say that it is increasingly clear to me, unfortunately, that unless we bring action and engage in formal complaints procedures, actually nothing happens. We've been talking about gender equality for many years, well sort of before me and before my life even. I hats off to the amazing work of the suffragettes that did so much to bring us a vote. And I think it is recognized internationally that yes, women should be part of leadership teams, women should be included. But when it comes to actually implementing these policies, the implementation just isn't there. And it reminds me in a very odd way of climate action, where again, we've learned about this climate problem, known about it for many decades, and still aren't seeing the action. And that's something that Paula mentioned earlier, is, that unless we take action, we're actually just heading for the wall. I mean, scientists are talking about climate chaos, reaching a point of climate chaos by 2030. And we are going through various tipping points at the moment, planetary tipping points, which we are not going to be able to address unless we bring in new architects, completely new builders, essentially, to look at this and to judge this situation with fresh eyes. I think it's almost unfair to ask the men to come in as change agents and turn everything upside down now and revolutionize or modernize or reinvent the existing systems, because we know we need to change the finance system, we need to change the energy system, we need to change the transport system, we even need to change the food system. So how are we going to do that if we keep on asking the same people that created these systems to change them when they're not sustainable? We have to bring in new people. And so how to do this? I think that having spent the whole last 18 months speaking to the UK COP team, from the president, the CEO, to the only female champion they had on the team, that was Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who was the champion for climate and adaptation, for adaptation and resilience, not herself a climate expert, not an adaptation or resilience expert. Unless we have these new voices, and ideally expert voices on the teams, we are not going to be able to effectively take decisions, even at international climate negotiations. And that is very, very disappointing, because I think a lot of our hope hangs on the COP, also the COP27. We have been working behind the scenes to lobby for a female president. The environment minister of Egypt is a woman, and we were told that she would make a very good president. However, someone else was chosen for that role. And we haven't seen a single woman being announced for the leadership team of that COP. And what does that tell us? That just tells us it's a repetition of yet again the same format. I'm really sorry to say that, because I don't want to sort of call off something before it's even started. But we know that business as usual is just not an option for us now.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pitt, and thank to all of you for your first remarks. I already see that we are receiving quite a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm starting to address some of them. I will start with a question addressed to Dr. Luis. So in your experience, what do women-owned small and medium businesses in Ghana need more from the international and national private sectors in agriculture and forestry sector?
Sure. So I'll first speak on, I guess I wear two hats, right? So I used to work for the US government. I worked on women's economic empowerment. And then I can also speak to it from being a business owner in Ghana. So I am the CEO of Crescendo Foods, which is a culinary incubator. And so we always talk about access to finance. And we always talk about, access to this are microloans, access to land. But the thing is, from a international perspective, the thing, what I always think about from both sides is that, what is the agenda? When we look at access to finance, yes, microloans are great, but, sometimes it doesn't really do anything. Maybe it might be more so looking at grant opportunities for people. And then actually now that since COVID has become since the pandemic, funding is becoming a little bit harder for early stage entrepreneurs. And, also thinking about inflation. And now that we have the Russo-Ukrainian War happening, you're starting to see that effect on everyone, but especially here on small business owners. Fuel has, of course, we've been affected by fuel as well. Also, our flour prices when it comes to purchasing bread. A lot of the countries here, on the continent purchase bread from Ukraine. So I think, from a private sector, thinking about it from a CSR perspective, when you're working with women, what does that mean? Do we need another leadership program? Probably not. What people may really need is funding. And actually helping them build a sustainable business, right? And then actually thinking about what is the role of a venture capitalist. And then if we're going to do, I know the African Development Bank did a huge overhaul project for women, African women entrepreneurs in agriculture a couple of years ago, and they talked about the banks. And a lot of the times banks, are ran by men, right? So you have patriarchy as well, is that they don't want to, they may not necessarily want to give loans to a woman because they don't think she'll pay it back. But statistics have shown that women actually pay it back way before, a man does, and usually pays back with interest in a very short time period. And it's not just in Ghana, it's everywhere. You even see it in the US, one of the biggest groups of, women who aren't being tapped with funding is African-American women. We never get any funding, right? And we pay back times twice, right? And so also thinking too is that when you're talking about small, medium businesses, yes, it's about livelihood, but also is it out of necessity? A lot of people have, these businesses, but what are the other things that they need? They also need funding. They also need market linkages. And what my company, Crescendo Foods, does is that we work with ag businesses to be able to have those market linkages and actually get them, ready for, the international market. And then I think another thing is too, is that when we're talking about, what can these other institutions do? Also look at it from an inward as well. So if you have a base in, let's say, Accra, and you also have a base in Mozambique, how can you connect those two people to those two systems together? Especially with the Africa Trade Agreement. A lot of women, entrepreneurs in the food space will be trying to figure out, how can I get here? And then I think that's an opportunity for folks to be able to take, to see that as an opportunity for private sector finance. Is it, I think really more so when you're talking about loans, that conversion, the CD here in Ghana is falling. How can we, still help with beefing up the, now not depreciation of the CD, but appreciating it, but also being able to make sure that people really are getting the best bang for their buck and they're actually seeing their products and their business being they're growing well, but also growing sustainably. Not just you gave me a grant or a loan for 2 years, this is enough, and then I got to come back to you. So, I think a lot of the times is that private sector also needs to really take a step back and think about, if I'm giving somebody this money, and I know I don't need to see them again in 15 years or ever again. What are the pillars and the knowledge that I need to help them, anybody help improve to make sure that they are actually taking the lessons learned to be able to grow a sustainable business?
Thank you very much. That's very important. And somehow it's related to the next question that we received from one of our participants. And I will address this question to Ms. Ellinger. So how the fight against inequalities impact climate change, and what are the concrete steps that have been and could be taken? And yes, we are looking for some concrete ideas and actions on this part.
Thank you, Ionela. Well, we need to change power relations, right? And this is very much reflected in finance and policies. But since you're looking for concrete examples, maybe I'll bring one example of an initiative that we supported a couple of years ago here in Argentina. That was for building energy efficiency in homes of poor people in urban areas, with an emphasis on single women household. So what the intervention was, and initially it was at the project level, we identified single women in poor areas, and we worked in their homes to do retrofitting, so increase the energy efficiency of their homes, especially in areas where it's very cold or very hot in the summer. And the results of that are very clear in terms of health benefits, but also the savings that they got from their energy bills at the end of the day represented more possibilities for them to have income in their monthly rates. So this is an example of how if we reduce inequality by tackling climate change, at the same time, we increase resilience of women in face of the impacts of climate change. And this was a project level initiative that later inspired policymaking. So this example was later translated to policies at local level, led by municipal governments. So I think this is an interesting step where we can identify interventions that can have a positive impact of increasing resilience of women and also their leadership roles. And once these pilot projects are successful, we can advocate for them to be included into policy making at national and subnational level.
Thank you very much. And now I have a question to Ms. Pitt. How can the effects of climate change, for example, climate migration, can be tackled from an institutional level?
Well, I think so I mentioned climate justice earlier and tackling inequalities. I think I've been really spending a lot of time in just the last year. So I'm no means as a long-standing expert on this, but well, actually the last decade, just looking at who was doing what globally and what solutions were being offered, and also what barriers we had to climate action and decision making, essentially, because really our climate crisis, our biodiversity crisis, even this war is actually a leadership crisis. It's a leadership crisis. And so we have institutions, and these institutions are not performing essentially the leadership functions that they should be performing, particularly at this point in time. And so what I always talk about now is that we need to build alternative structures, essentially. Now, I'm a big fan of organizations, institutions generally, but if they don't perform the functions that they were originally designed for, we have a huge problem. And I think everyone recognizes that this stasis, essentially, that we've been seeing, or this rather too slow development and sometimes even backward development is not going to bring us the solutions. We need to come up with alternative solutions. And I'm very interested in, for example, the Global Assembly, which is a movement that is being set up, modeled on the French Citizens Assembly that was designed to let ordinary citizens come together and make policy recommendations to government. A global assembly is being developed as we speak. It will have 50-50 vision. We always call for 50-50 vision at the top. That means equal representation of men and women, true representation of the people, not influenced necessarily by politics or you know, and other sort of, and also corporate interests, you know, which also play a huge role. The largest delegation at COP26 was the fossil fuel delegation. We need to build these alternative structures now to really be able to move forward, I would say, with policy. We can't actually expect policy to be created if institutions are led by a tiny fraction of the world's population that is not representative for the rest of the world's population, and in fact has created a blind spot essentially from which policy decisions are taken for the rest of the world's population. And I think we also need to bring in new frameworks. So frameworks are very, very important, and we are campaigning to, or supporting the Stop Ecocide campaign, which is campaigning to make ecocide a crime in international law. If we can agree on that, I think as a framework, then everything else should hopefully fall much more into place. And in terms of how in terms of adaptation and resilience, a huge amount of work needs to be done on that. We are not, I think we are at the point at the moment where we've just admitted that we have a problem. I think we are at that point globally. I think at COP26 there was that admission, but we're not at the point where we have even started looking at what adaptation we have to take. For example, you know, the 200 million people that are forecast to lose their homes in the global south from rising sea levels alone, and many of those will be women. But I think as Dr. Lewis said, you know, if women, for example, lose their homes, or if women suffer, everyone suffers. It's not just the women, it's the boys that are with the women, it's the men as well. So yeah, again, redirecting finance. I would also completely agree that is critical, absolutely critical, redirecting finance to women to shift things more quickly now.
Thank you very much. As we are running out of time, I have a last question that I will address to all of you. And it's about the current Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war. And I'm wondering how this war will impact, and what's your perspective? How do you see that this war will impact the climate action targets and the food security?
Shall I start? Was the other thinking? Well, this war is, as we know, is a complete catastrophe. Peace is the absolute foundation for our civilization, and the SDGs address this as well. I think we haven't done enough during peace times to build peace. And what we see now is that unless we have peace, we cannot really develop the other policies at all. Particularly, you know, climate is very negatively affected. Both Russia and the Ukraine are oil and wheat producing nations, and this will hugely impact us, you know, both on the food chain and as we see also with energy prices. And women, interestingly, again in our research, showed that peace negotiations that include women are far more successful. The World Economic Forum did a fantastic video on that I will post in the chat. But unless we have women in the peace, you know, if there even is a peace negotiation process, I think I'm not aware. I mean, there is sort of the bilateral conversation between the two presidents of the country, but I'm not aware of any women that are currently negotiating a peace process. So again, my recommendation would there be to perhaps set up an independent body of Ukrainian and Russian citizens that meet outside both countries in a neutral state to discuss how they see their relationship, how they want to see their relationship develop. And but the current, so what we also know is climate will bring conflict. So climate brings war, as climate change brings war, unfortunately, and to some degree, we can ask about the motivation for this war, perhaps as well. This is something that I would love to see discussed in more detail, by people who are closer to the conflict. But climate will impact security around the world, will impact food security around the world. We are dependent, absolutely 100% dependent on the ecosystem services that we have so taken for granted for such a long time. And if our ecosystems collapse, we would have war. And also to some degree, if we have war, part of our ecosystem collapses, as we see now, or at least the services that we have been taking for granted with food supply coming out of, say, Russia and the Ukraine. And that will impact us very negatively.
Thank you very much. Who would like to go first?
As you wish, Dr. Lewis, but I may otherwise. Well, as Bianca Pitt already mentioned, a hydrocarbon world is a world where more conflict takes place, and this is making things very clear. As we are seeing, the war is driving energy prices, wheat prices, fertilizers, supply up, and this might lead to a food crisis. I think this analysis is very clear. Now, the key question is how it will impact the global climate action. And there are two extreme and possible responses to that. One is that we might just take the road that have taken us here today to the climate crisis that we are living, and that is continue investing in fossil fuels and continue driving our world driven by hydrocarbons and conflict. That is intensifying the current development paradigm. I believe this is not what we all want, and that's not also foreseen in the climate commitments that countries are presented at the United Nations climate conference. Yet we are seeing that many of the reactions to the war are being in this direction. But of course, I believe that we have a very strong opportunity to change things and to make the war accelerate the transition to a resilient and net zero world. So if we take this opportunity to reduce our energy consumption, to increase energy efficiency, to increase our investments in adaptation in the agriculture sector, this can lead us to respond not only to the war, but most important to the climate crisis that's gonna lead us to further wars, as Bianca Pitt correctly reminded us. So it's on our hands. It's on the hands of decision makers. Depending on the political decisions that are taken, I believe we have the chance to transform this war into a reason to accelerate the climate transition.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lewis?
Yes, I think, I think what people fail to realize is that to both of Bianca and Paula's point is that how much this is turned into a catastrophe, because I think a lot of folks did not realize the ripple effect of, what it's going to happen to the food supply system, not only in Russia and Ukraine, but across the world. And so, we're starting to see how, all of these things are chained together. And when we're talking about these negotiations, one thing that of course stands out is that, we're not thinking about all the players that come to mind when we're talking about negotiations, right? Because now we're starting to realize, or at least a lot of people may have forgotten, is that Africans do live in these countries and the mistreatment that they're receiving, right? And so in order for us to really have a conversation, we need to make sure that everyone is heard, and also really seeing how that is going to be, what is the next step. And that's probably going, and having those realistic, conversations, which means that we'll also have to really have a realistic conversation about colonialism and how it still plays a key in some of these decisions, and how food security is kind of hanging in the balance, right? And so, unfortunately, what we're seeing with this war is that we don't know what's going to happen, but we know what we can expect of, continuing fuel prices, and of course, what's going to happen when we have, all this carbon being released into the air. And so in order, and then of course that affects women, that affects girls, it affects everyone. And so, where we're starting to see now here on the continent is that you're starting to see a little bit of both sides, right? So you see folks who are in the beginning who are very pro-Russia because they're standing up to the West, but what they are now starting to realize is that, wait a minute, Russia and Ukraine treat us just like everybody else does, and that's not good. So really having that realistic conversation, especially since people are now being kind of moved back to being home, but also too, what does that mean for these countries and these continents who rely on the imports and the importing and maybe exporting to Russia and Ukraine? Does that mean that, becomes more of a situation where, Ghana and Nigeria both have their own oil reserve, right? Does that mean, do they have enough to be able to, supply their own country or the surrounding countries? Because no one knows how long that's going to last. Does that mean that the West is going to come in and say, wait a minute, what are you doing? And having those realistic conversations. Does that also mean that as Africa as a continent, are we going to come together and say, hey, if we're shut out of this situation, what is that going to look like for us? Because you see it time and time again with the pandemic, you see it with all, fill in the blank, right? And so in order for us to really be food secure, is everyone going to be okay if one country decides to be food secure and someone else doesn't come and say, now wait, I want my cut of my money too? And that can be internally, that can happen within a country. That can also happen outside of that country, outside of that continent. So in order for us to really kind of move forward, what does that mean? And we're starting to see that domino effect across the world. And, if someone else gets a little bit upset about someone not doing something that they want them to do, how's that going to affect not only that region of the world, but everyone? And also understanding and really kind of debunking this narrative that I've been seeing on the news is, oh my God, it's Europeans fighting against Europeans. And it's like, no, it's war. It doesn't matter what color they are. It's war, and it affects everyone. So I think that's something that we always need to come to always have to have, and it shouldn't even be in the back of your mind. You should always know it's going to be there. People migrate all the time. And not just women, but just families. And so if this is not resolved, not only climate change is going to be an issue, but trust me, we're going to be having a huge population pandemic because everyone is not included in that conversation. Or I should say, everyone's going to be continued not to be a part of that conversation.
Thank you very much. That's a very important issue. And to end our discussion, this was very insightful. So thank you again for our excellent panelists for their valuable ideas and comments. And thank you to all of you, our audience, for questions and following this online policy dialogue. We here at EPC have many more events in the pipeline, so please follow us online and see you at the next event. Thank you very much. Have an enjoyable afternoon, everyone. Goodbye.